"You're coming with me," said the Lone Rancher after her in-laws tried to ruin her life. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long, warm shadows across the vast ranch. Sarah, a woman in her mid-30s, stood by the front porch of her small but sturdy farmhouse, taking in the morning air. The sky was clear, and the fields stretched for miles around her. It was a peaceful life, a life she had built from the ground up. Sarah had always dreamed of living on a ranch. She'd grown up in the city, surrounded by noise, people, and the chaos of daily life, but she longed for the open space, the quiet, the connection with nature. Breath. So, when she was old enough, she bought the ranch and moved far away from the noise and fast pace of city life. It wasn't easy at first. She had to learn everything about farming, cattle, and maintaining the land, but Sarah had always been determined. She worked hard, and slowly the ranch began to thrive, breaking. She spent her days working on the land, fixing fences, tending to the animals, and making sure everything ran smoothly. At night she would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees. It was the kind of life she had always wanted, simple, fulfilling, and full of purpose. Her life, however, had not always been so serene. It had been over a year since she had married Jake, a kind-hearted man with a similar love for the land. Jake had grown up on a neighboring ranch, and his family had known Sarah's for years. When they married, Sarah became a part of his family, an extension of his world, and for the most part she had fit in well. But there was something about Jake's family that didn't sit well with her. They were kind enough on the surface, but Sarah always felt like she was being watched, judged, and subtly pushed around. It wasn't that they didn't like her, but they didn't seem to respect her choices. They had a vision for how things should be, and they expected everyone, especially Jake, to follow it. At first, Sarah brushed off their interference. It was typical for in-laws to have opinions, she thought. But over time, their meddling began to feel more invasive. It was as if they wanted to control every part of her life. The more she tried to make decisions for herself, the more they pushed back. Jake's mother, Margaret, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in subtly criticizing Sarah's way of managing the ranch.
Whether it was about the color of the barn or the way Sarah handled the animals, Margaret always had something to say.
"Don't you think you should paint the barn red? It's what people expect on a ranch like this," Margaret had once suggested, her voice sweet but firm. Sarah had smiled politely and replied, "I think I'll keep it the way it is. It's the way Jake and I like it." Margaret didn't take well to that answer. She simply nodded. But Sarah could see the disapproval in her eyes. Bait. It wasn't the first time Margaret had made such comments, and it wouldn't be the last. The quiet pressure to conform was constant, but Sarah had always remained firm. Still, the tension grew. There were always family gatherings, holiday dinners, and visits where Jake's family would gather around, their eyes trained on Sarah, offering unsolicited advice. They assumed she would take on the role of a traditional ranch wife, someone who followed the path they had set for her. But Sarah was no ordinary ranch wife. She was a rancher in her own right, someone who had worked hard to create this life, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. It wasn't long before Sarah realized she had underestimated the depth of her in-laws' control over Jake. Although he loved Sarah deeply, there was always this underlying sense of loyalty to his family, a loyalty that often made him hesitant to push back when they overstepped. One day, after Sarah had spent hours fixing the fences in the scorching sun, she came inside to find a letter on the kitchen counter. It was from Jake's parents inviting them to a family dinner at their house. At first, Sarah felt a sense of unease, but she didn't think much of it. She was used to these kinds of gatherings. That evening, she and Jake drove to his parents' house, a grand old ranch that had been in the family for generations. Sarah could feel the familiar knot forming in her stomach as they walked inside. The large dining room was filled with family members, all chatting over dinner. Margaret greeted them with a tight smile and a quick hug, but there was something different in her eyes. It was subtle, but Sarah could sense it. The evening progressed uneventfully at first. They ate, they chatted, and Sarah tried to make light of things, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Jake's father, Robert, cleared his throat and turned to Sarah. Breath.
"Sarah, we've been meaning to talk to you about something," Robert said, his voice low and serious. Sarah's heart skipped a beat.
"What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've been looking at the ranch," he continued, "and we think it's time for you to start thinking about selling. You know, there are other opportunities, and with your husband being so busy, it might be better for both of you." "Sell the ranch?" She looked at Jake, who was sitting quietly beside her. "Jake never mentioned anything about that." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dad, we've talked about it before, but I don't think it's the right time. The ranch is doing well, and Sarah is really invested in it." Robert shook his head, a look of frustration crossing his face.
"You're being too sentimental, son. We've been telling you this for years."
"You're both working too hard for a small piece of land that could be put to much better use. This is just a business decision." Margaret nodded in agreement.
It's the practical thing to do.
"You can't expect to keep running this place on your own forever, Sarah. Maybe it's time to think about something more sustainable." The words stung. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists as the reality of what they were suggesting hit her. They were talking about her life, her hard work, her dreams, her independence, as if it was something to be sold off. This wasn't just about the ranch. This was about her choices, her identity.
"I think you're overstepping," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "This ranch is mine."
"It's not just some business decision. It's my home, and I won't be giving it up. Not now, not ever." Breaths. Jake's parents exchanged glances, their disappointment evident. But Sarah stood her ground. Brr. She wasn't going to let them take away the life she had worked so hard to build. That night, as they drove back to their ranch, Sarah could feel the weight of the conversation hanging between them. But Jake didn't say much, but Sarah could tell he was troubled. The tension was thick in the air, and Sarah couldn't help but feel the growing divide between her and Jake's family. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about respect. It was about freedom. And it was about standing up for what she had worked so hard to create. The ranch wasn't just a place. It was her life. And she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. But deep down, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The pressure from Jake's family wasn't going to stop. Breaths. It was only going to get worse. And she had a feeling that soon she would have to make a choice that could change everything. The days following the dinner with Jake's parents were tense. Frowned. He glances around in despair. Sarah couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. Every time she walked across the ranch, every time she worked with the animals, she felt the weight of her in-laws' words pressing down on her. She had always been proud of the life she had created, but now it seemed like that life was under attack. They wanted her to sell, to give up everything she had built. It was hard to believe that the people who were supposed to support her could treat her dreams as if they were insignificant. Jake, on the other hand, was caught in the middle. He could feel the strain between his wife and his family, but he didn't know how to fix it. His loyalty to his family was strong, and although he didn't agree with their view on the ranch, he still hesitated to completely break away from them. Every time Sarah tried to talk to him about what was happening, Jake would listen, but he never seemed to fully understand the extent of her frustration. He thought they would just get over it, but Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. She had tried to be patient. She had tried to ignore the little comments, the subtle jabs at her way of running the ranch, but things had gone too far.
Brave, this wasn't just about a disagreement over how to manage the land or what color to paint the barn. It was about her being treated as if her decisions didn't matter.
She was being undermined by the people who should have been supporting her, and Sarah had had enough. One afternoon, Sarah was working on the far side of the ranch, repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged by the recent storm. The wind was picking up, and the air had that crisp, fresh scent of rain. Sarah enjoyed working alone. It gave her time to think and process everything that had been going on. She was just finishing up when she saw Jake's truck driving toward her. She wiped her brow, expecting him to stop and offer to help, but instead he pulled up alongside the fence and parked. "Hey," he said, his tone a little too casual. He didn't get out of the truck immediately, just sat there looking at her with an unreadable expression. Brass. Sarah straightened up and brushed the dirt off her hands. "What's going on?" Breath. "I thought you were at the cattle auction today."
I was,
Jake said, still sitting in the truck.
"But there's something we need to talk about."
Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had a feeling she knew exactly where this conversation was going, but she didn't want to assume. "What's on your mind?" Jake took a deep breath, then finally stepped out of the truck. "My parents called me this morning," he said, his voice heavy. "They want to meet with us again. They're not giving up on their idea about selling the ranch." Rain. Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped that after their last conversation, Jake's parents would have backed off. But it seemed they were more determined than ever. She took a step back, feeling the frustration rise inside her. "I'm not selling, Jake. I don't care what they think." "This ranch is mine." "I know, Sarah," Jake said, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but my family is. They're not going to let this go. You know how they are. They've been in this business for generations, and they believe they know what's best for us." Sarah shook her head.
"I don't care about their business sense. This isn't about money or what they think is practical."
"This is my home, Jake. My life." Breaths. "And they're trying to take it from me." Jake's face softened, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "I don't want to lose you over this, Sarah. I really don't. But I also don't want to upset my parents. They're my family." Breaths.
"Your family?" Sarah's voice cracked.
"Jake, they've been disrespecting me for months, and you're still worried about upsetting them? What about me? What about my dreams?"
"This ranch isn't just a piece of land. It's everything I've worked for."
Jake opened his mouth to say something, but Sarah cut him off. She was too angry, too hurt to let him speak. "Do you even understand what they're doing to me?" she asked, her voice rising.
"Every time they tell me how to run things, every time they try to control my decisions, it feels like they're telling me I don't matter."
"Dad, I'm not capable of doing this on my own. I've been working this ranch for years, Jake, long before we even got married."
"This is who I am. I know, Sarah," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Breath. "I know it's hard, but my family doesn't see it the same way. They think they're just helping." "Helping?" Sarah scoffed. Breaths. "They're not helping. They're controlling, and you're letting them." "I'm done with it. I'm done feeling like I'm not good enough for them, like I have to prove myself, just to be heard."
"I can't live like this anymore." The anger in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, Jake saw just how deep the hurt went. He had always known Sarah was strong, but now he saw how much strength it had taken for her to keep pushing forward despite the constant pressure from his family.
I don't know what to say, Jake admitted, looking down at the ground.
Break. You don't need to say anything, Jake. You need to make a choice. Sarah's voice was firm, but there was a hint of sadness behind her words. You can either stand with me and defend our life together, or you can stand with them, but I'm not going to keep fighting for something that doesn't matter to you. Jake was silent for a long moment. The wind rustled the trees around them, and Sarah could hear the faint sound of distant cattle lowing. The ranch seemed quieter than usual, the weight of the moment settling in.
Finally, Jake spoke. I don't want to lose you, Sarah.
But I don't know if I can stand up to my parents. They've always been there for me.
Sarah's heart ached. She had known this was coming, but it still hurt. Then I guess you've made your choice. Without another word, she turned and walked away from him, heading back toward the house. She didn't look back. There was nothing more to say. As Sarah walked across the ranch, the reality of her situation hit her. For the first time, she felt completely alone. She had always prided herself on being independent. But now, it seemed like she was facing an even bigger battle. Her marriage was at a crossroads, and her in-laws were determined to tear apart everything she had worked for.
But Sarah wasn't one to back down easily.
She had come too far, worked too hard, and sacrificed too much to let anyone take her life away from her. This wasn't just about the ranch. It was about her freedom, her voice, and her right to make her own choices. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even Jake, stop her. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah made a decision. She would fight for this ranch, for her home, for her future. She didn't know how or when it would all work out, but she was done waiting for someone else to decide her fate. This was her life, and she was going to live it on her own terms. The following days felt like a blur for Sarah. She had spent countless hours working on the ranch, keeping herself busy with the daily tasks, trying to avoid thinking about the deepening tension between her and Jake. Each time they spoke, there was an uncomfortable distance between them, an unspoken gap that neither of them could bridge. It was clear to Sarah that the strain of the situation was beginning to show in their relationship. Jake had stopped coming around as much.
He was spending more time at his parents' house, trying to make peace with them, while Sarah was left to deal with the fallout, alone. She couldn't blame him entirely. He was torn between his love for her and his loyalty to his family, a loyalty that had been ingrained in him for years. But for Sarah, this wasn't just about a conflict between her and her in-laws. It was about her future, her independence, and her right to make choices for her own life. She wasn't going to sit by and let it all slip away, not after everything she had built. The thought of selling the ranch was never an option for Sarah. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had fought for every inch of success. The idea that someone, even Jake's family, thought they could take that from her was maddening. She had worked too hard to give it all up. But now the pressure was mounting, and she was starting to feel the weight of it more than ever. One afternoon, after a long day of repairing the barn, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sunset as the sky turned from a soft pink to deep purple. It had been one of those days where everything seemed to fall into place. The animals were fed, the land was tended to, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt a sense of peace.
But that feeling was fleeting, and soon the weight of the situation crept back in. She had tried to talk to Jake again, but it was the same story. He was unsure, caught in the middle.
His family was pushing hard for a sale, and no matter how many times Sarah explained that it was her decision to make, Jake seemed unable to take a stand. Every time he tried to talk to his parents, they wore him down, convincing him that he was doing the right thing by listening to them. It broke Sarah's heart to see him so conflicted, but it also made her realize something. If she didn't take control of the situation herself, she might lose everything she cared about. That night, as the stars began to twinkle above, Sarah made a decision. It was time to act. She couldn't keep waiting for Jake to figure things out. And she certainly couldn't wait for her in-laws to stop interfering. She needed to take the reins herself to find a way to protect what was hers before it slipped out of her grasp. The next morning, Sarah began making plans. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, but she knew she couldn't stay in limbo forever. She had already started to make arrangements with her lawyer, looking into ways she could secure her land and protect it from any legal challenges. It wasn't going to be easy, but Sarah wasn't afraid of a challenge. She had spent years facing obstacles, and each time she had come out stronger. This time would be no different. But it wasn't just the legal battles that worried her. There was something deeper at play. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if Jake would stand by her if things came to a head. She had always believed that their bond was strong enough to weather any storm, but now she wasn't so sure. The distance between them had grown, and with each passing day, Sarah found herself questioning whether they could ever be on the same side again. Every tense conversation with Jake, Sarah found herself standing in the middle of the barn, staring out at the land. The wind had picked up, and the sound of it whipping through the trees was oddly comforting. For a moment she closed her eyes and tried to push aside the confusion in her mind. The ranch had always been her anchor, the one constant she could rely on. But now, it felt like everything she had known was slipping away.
It was then that she realized something important. She couldn't keep fighting a battle that wasn't just about her anymore.
It was time to make a decision. If she wanted to save her home, she had to be willing to take matters into her own hands. The thought of leaving was hard, but Sarah knew it was the right thing to do. She had worked tirelessly to create this life for herself, and she couldn't let anyone, family or not, take that from her. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. She couldn't sit by and wait for Jake to choose for herself. The next morning, Sarah called her lawyer and made arrangements to put the ranch in a trust, a move that would protect it from any potential claims. Trust. It was a step she had been avoiding, but now it felt like the only way forward.
The lawyer assured her that with the right paperwork, the ranch would be secure.
But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. There was still the matter of Jake and his family to deal with. Later that day, Sarah sat down with Jake. She knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy, but it had to happen. She needed to make it clear that she wasn't going to be pushed around any longer.
Jake, we need to talk, she said, her voice steady but firm.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty.
About what? About the ranch, Sarah replied, taking a deep breath.
About what's going to happen next, I've made some decisions, Jake, and I need you to understand. Jake's expression shifted, a hint of concern flashing across his face. What kind of decisions? I'm taking control, she said, her voice resolute. I've put the ranch in a trust. It's the only way to protect it from any legal claims. I'm not selling, and I'm not letting anyone, especially your parents, take it from me. Breaths. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up a hand, cutting him off. I'm not asking for your approval, Jake. This is something I have to do. I've been patient. I've tried to talk to you, but your family won't stop. And I can't keep waiting for you to choose. I need to protect what's mine. There was silence between them for a long moment. Jake looked down at the ground, his fists clenched at his sides. Sarah could see the internal struggle on his face, but she didn't give him the chance to respond.
I've made up my mind, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your family. I'm just asking you to understand that this is my life, my decision. If you can't stand with me, then I'll have to do this on my own. With that, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there lost in thought. The weight of the moment hung in the air, but Sarah knew she had made the right choice. She had done everything she could to make things work, but now it was time to take control of her own destiny. As the sun set over the ranch that evening, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The hardest part was over. Now, she could finally move forward and fight for the life she had always dreamed of. The days following Sarah's decision to put the ranch in a trust felt like a whirlwind. The paperwork was all in place, and for a brief moment Sarah allowed herself to feel a sense of relief. But the peace she had longed for didn't last long. The reality of her situation began to set in. She was in for a fight, and she wasn't sure just how difficult it was going to be. Jake had withdrawn even more, spending most of his time with his parents, trying to make sense of everything. And Sarah knew he was struggling. She could see the conflict in his eyes whenever they spoke, the way he looked at her with uncertainty and pain. He loved her, but his loyalty to his family was strong, and that was something Sarah couldn't change. But she had learned the hard way that she couldn't keep waiting for him to decide. One evening as Sarah was finishing up in the barn, she saw a car pull up the long driveway. It was Jake's parents, of course. They had been relentless in their pursuit to convince Sarah to sell the ranch, and Sarah knew that this visit wasn't going to be any different. The truck came to a halt and Margaret and Robert stepped out, their faces set in serious expressions. Rest, her hand resting on the side of the barn. She had hoped she could put this behind her, but it seemed that wasn't going to happen. She walked out to meet them, trying to keep her composure. "What brings you here today?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Margaret wasted no time. "Sarah, this has gone on long enough." "You're being stubborn. You can't run this place on your own forever." "It's time to face facts." Robert stepped forward, his voice heavy. "We've been trying to make you understand, but it seems like you're set on making a mistake. We've seen how hard you've worked, but this ranch is too much for you to handle alone." Sarah's heart pounded, but she refused to let her emotions show. She had heard it all before, but hearing it again only made her more determined. "I can handle this ranch just fine," she said, standing her ground. "I've built this from the ground up, and I'm not going to let anyone take it from me." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Jake is a part of this family too, Sarah. He can't keep choosing between you and us."
"You're pushing him into a corner." "I'm not pushing him into anything," Sarah replied, her voice steady.
"Desp, he's a grown man, and he's made his choices. But this is my ranch. It's my decision. I'm not asking for anyone's permission." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Robert and Margaret exchanged a look, then turned back to Sarah. "You're making a mistake," Robert said, his voice firm. "This is going to tear your marriage apart." "Is this really worth it?" Sarah stood silently for a moment, the weight of their words pressing down on her. But then, something inside her shifted. She had heard all the warnings, all the suggestions, but she knew what she needed to do. This wasn't just about the ranch, Bert. This was about her future, her dignity, and her right to make her own decisions. "I won't let anyone take this from me," she said firmly, her voice rising just slightly. "Not you. Not anyone. This is my life, and I'm going to live it the way I choose.
Margaret's face twisted with frustration, but Sarah didn't back down.
She had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to sell. The pressure, the ranch was hers, and she would fight for it, no matter what. The conversation ended in silence, and Sarah watched as her in-laws got back into their car and drove away. But even as the dust settled behind them, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Breaths. She had done everything she could to make her point, but she knew it wasn't over. The fight for the ranch was far from finished. In the days that followed, the pressure continued to build. Sarah's lawyer had been working on the paperwork for the trust, but she knew that her in-laws wouldn't just give up. They had money, resources, and connections, and Sarah understood that they would use all of them to get what they wanted. But she was ready for whatever came next. She had already proven that she was strong enough to stand up for herself. Now she had to prove that she could see this fight through to the end. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter from her lawyer. It was a formal notice from Jake's family stating their intention to challenge the trust and dispute her ownership of the ranch. The letter was filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were not backing down. They were going to fight her for control of the land. Sarah felt a cold chill run through her as she read the letter. This was what she had been preparing for. But the reality of it hit her hard. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier. The next few days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Sarah met with her lawyer to discuss her options, and she knew that things were going to get even more complicated. She wasn't just fighting for the ranch anymore. She was fighting for her life, for everything she had worked so hard to build. The pressure was overwhelming, and there were moments when Sarah felt like giving up. But then she would step outside and look at the land she had worked so hard to make her own, and she would remember why she had to keep going. This ranch was more than just a piece of property. It was her legacy, her future, and it was worth fighting for. As the legal battle began, Sarah's life became a blur of court dates, legal meetings, and countless hours spent trying to keep the ranch running. It was exhausting both physically and emotionally, but Sarah refused to give in. She had always been a fighter, and this was no different. There were days when she wanted to scream, when the weight of it all felt like it was going to crush her. But she kept going, kept fighting, because she knew that if she didn't, she would lose everything. Throughout it all, Jake remained distant. They spoke occasionally, but it was clear that he was torn. He loved her, but his family's influence was too strong. Sarah couldn't force him to choose her, but she had to keep moving forward. She had made her decision, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Jake, change that. One evening, as Sarah sat alone on the porch after a long day, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The sky was dark, the stars shining brightly above her. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the night fill her ears, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of the trees in the wind. It was peaceful, a moment of solitude in the midst of all the chaos. She didn't know how long the fight would last or what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt sure of one thing. She was doing the right thing. She wasn't just fighting for the ranch. She was fighting for herself, for her right to live her life on her own terms. She had come too far to back down now. And no matter what happened next, she would face it with the same strength and determination that had carried her this far. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest that Sarah had ever faced. The legal battle had begun in earnest, and it seemed like everything she had worked for was hanging by a thread. The pressure from Jake's family didn't let up. They continued to fight her at every turn, trying to discredit her and undermine her position. Their lawyers were relentless, using every trick in the book to try and take control of the ranch. But Sarah had made up her mind. She wasn't going to back down. She had spent years building her life around this land, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers without a fight. Every day she found herself at her lawyer's office, reviewing documents, attending court hearings, and making sure her case was as strong as possible. She had no choice. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for her independence, her future, and the life she had built from scratch. Jake, for his part, had become more distant. He visited the ranch occasionally, but it was clear that his mind was elsewhere. Sarah could see the strain in his face every time they spoke. She knew he loved her, but his loyalty to his parents was something he couldn't shake. It was heartbreaking to see him torn between his family and the woman he had married. There were moments when Sarah wanted to scream at him, to tell him that this was his chance to stand up for her, to stand up for their life together. But instead, she kept quiet. She had made the decision to take control of her own destiny, and she couldn't rely on Jake to do that for her. If he wasn't willing to fight for her and the ranch, then she would do it alone. Psst. She had no other choice. One day, after another grueling day in court, Sarah stood on the porch of the ranch, watching the sun begin to set. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was still, almost as if the world was holding its breath. She had been so consumed with the fight that she had barely taken a moment to enjoy the beauty of the land. But now, as she stood there, taking in the peacefulness around her, she realized just how much she had come to love this place. This was her home. This was the life she had worked so hard to create. And no matter how difficult the battle had been, she couldn't let it go. She had to win. For herself, for the ranch, and for everything she had fought for. The next day, Sarah received a call from her lawyer. The case was nearing its conclusion, and there was a final hearing scheduled for the following week. It was the moment of truth. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was here, Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. This wasn't just a legal case. It was her future, her dreams, and her entire life. As the day of the final hearing approached, Sarah found herself more nervous than she had ever been. She had done everything she could to ensure her case was airtight, but she knew that anything could happen. She had seen the way Jake's family had been fighting tooth and nail to take control of the ranch. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and Sarah was ready to face whatever came her way. The day of the hearing arrived, and Sarah stood in the courthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. Her lawyer stood beside her, his calm demeanor a small comfort in the midst of the storm. The room was filled with people. Jake's family, their lawyers, and the judge who would ultimately decide the fate of the ranch. The tension was palpable, and Sarah could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The proceedings began, and Sarah listened carefully as her lawyer made his case. He spoke about her rights to the ranch, the work she had done to build it up, and the fact that the land was hers, legally, morally, and without question. It was clear that the case was in her favor. But Sarah knew that the decision wasn't going to be an easy one. The judge had the power to rule in favor of Jake's family, and Sarah had no idea what the outcome would be. When it was finally her turn to speak, Sarah stood up, her voice steady and strong. "This ranch is my home," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "I've spent years working on it, building it, and making it my own." "It's not just a piece of land. It's my future. It's my legacy. I've fought hard for everything I have, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, but she didn't let it stop her. "I've worked harder than anyone can understand to make this ranch what it is. I've put my heart and soul into it, and I won't let it slip away because of someone else's greed. This is my life, and I will fight for it."
For the first time during the hearing, Sarah saw Jake's parents shift uncomfortably in their seats.
They had always assumed they could control her, manipulate her into selling the ranch. But now, as Sarah spoke from the heart, they began to see the strength of her resolve.
When the judge finally rendered his decision, Sarah could hardly breathe. She had done everything she could to prepare, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. The judge took a long moment before speaking, and for what felt like an eternity, Sarah waited. "The court finds in favor of the defendant," the judge said, his voice clear. "The ranch is legally and rightfully yours, Ms.
Walker, the claim by the plaintiffs is dismissed."
A wave of relief washed over Sarah as the words sank in. She had won. The ranch was hers, and she could finally breathe again. It wasn't just a victory in the court. It was a victory for her independence, her future, and her right to make her own choices. After the hearing, Sarah stepped out into the fresh air, the weight of the decision finally lifting from her shoulders. She felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known in months. The fight had been long, and it had taken everything she had, but she had emerged victorious. Later that evening, as she sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset once again, Sarah allowed herself a moment of peace. The battle was over, and she had come out on top. She wasn't just the owner of the ranch. She was the owner of her future, Dome. She had fought for what she believed in, and now she was free to live her life on her terms. As the days passed, Sarah found herself growing closer to the land, more connected to the life she had fought so hard to protect. She began to rebuild her relationship with Jake, but this time it was different. She had learned that she couldn't depend on anyone else to fight her battles. She had to fight for herself, and that made her stronger. Jake, too, began to understand the depth of Sarah's commitment to the ranch and to their life together. He apologized for his hesitation, and together they began to rebuild their marriage. It wasn't easy, but Sarah had learned the importance of standing her ground, of making her own choices, and of never giving up on the things that truly mattered. Best. As the seasons changed, the ranch flourished. Sarah's heart was lighter, her future brighter. But more importantly, she had learned the value of standing strong and staying true to herself. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.